Hey, friends. Welcome back to Fervent in Life, the only podcast where we seek to make disciples one explanation at a time. It's late. Forgive me. Um, but I was just in God's presence. I asked him. First of all, he's revealed, a lot to me this past week and couple days and whatnot. And yeah, just in his presence, and I was just asking him, what is the message for this episode? Um, and he brought me into Daniel 3, and we're gonna do something a little bit different this episode because I'm actually going to be reading a passage of scripture in almost its entirety, right? And he told me to start from Daniel 3:10, right? And for some context, this is where King Nebuchadnezzar, right? He's talking to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And it starts at Daniel 3:10. And it says, they're talking to King Nebuchadnezzar, you as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, right? And when I say they, these are like his, some of his subjects. So it's not, Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego. It's other people talking about them, right? So Daniel 3:11, right? 3:12, excuse me. There are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Then, in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, sided lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. This is a point right here, so I want to take note, right? Daniel 3:16. This is their reply. Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you, as king, to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. And I want to pause right there, right? Because clearly, Nebuchadnezzar is a figure, right? He is the king of Babylon. And you don't know, Babylon is known for having a multitude of gods that are not God, right? And what these three men here are saying in response to Nebuchadnezzar's question of who is going to save you from me, they said, we don't need to answer you. We don't need to tell you because you're going to see. And even if he doesn't, this is important, they didn't doubt God. Like when they said, if he saves us, it wasn't an if to say that they were doubting God's ability to save them. It was if, in the sense of if it's in his will to save us, then you'll see. But even if it's not in his will for him to save us, we're still not choosing you, right? And I think this is important because sometimes, and this is what God is really trying to tune in for me specifically, is that our desires are truly different from God's plan, right? But we can't turn away from Him if things go differently than how we expected them to go, right? And they gave their full trust to God, and the key part to note here that they were faithful regardless of the outcome, right? So now we continue Daniel 3:19, right? Says, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary, and he commanded some of the best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men in their trousers, robes, and head coverings and other clothes were tied up and thrown into the blazing fire. Since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. And it's important to note here that Nebuchadnezzar was mad. He was so mad. And I think this part in particular is just interesting because it shows how when we're choosing God, the people around us are not going to be on the same wavelength, and they're going to get so upset, and they're going to look at us like we are crazy. But the important thing to note here is when it said, because his command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, those people who try to combat our choices, right? Because if we're living for God, those people who aren't living for God are living of the flesh, right? And here's the thing, the flesh brings destruction, right? Because it's that impulse, right? So when you're covered by God, you're going to be fine. But these people who are not and who are living of the flesh, they make impulsive decisions. And he did not think about, he was so filled with rage, he did not think about how this was going to backfire and how he was going to lose his own people into pursuit of harming and causing suffering to God's people. And if we continue on, Daniel 3:24, then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire? Yes, of course, your majesty, they replied to the king. He exclaimed, look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. And we're going to pause here, right? Because right here, when he says, look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods, right? This leads to the message for the podcast and why I really wanted to bring up, because God gave me a message and he said to me, he wanted to let me know, but he also wanted me to take this in myself as well. And he says, I will not let you burn in the fire, because the fire in your life is to reach those who don't know me. The harm they bring you will not harm you, but you must know that I am your God and submit to my will. Do not be afraid of the fire, for I will not let you burn. And the important thing to note here also is when it says 4 men, God was right there with them in the fire. It's not like God was overlooking and he let them go into the fire and be thrown into the fire. No, God went into the fire. And not only did he go into the fire, originally Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were bound. when thrown into the fire. And God went into the fire, untied them, covered them, protected them, and they were walking with him. So what normally would have hurt them clearly had no effect at all on them. So now we go to 26. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God. Now he knows who God is. Come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, prefects, and governors, and the king's adversaries gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar explained, Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any gods except their own God. Therefore, I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb, and his house a garbage dump. There is no other God who is able to deliver like this. Excuse me. And this in itself is directly correlated to when God said, the fire in your life is meant to reach other people. Because even though we are being put into a fire, when we think about fire, it burns everything. When we think about fire, we think, ouch, like that's gonna hurt. But all it is the fire is refinement. And the fire is going to burn. Think about it like this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were bound by rope, I'm assuming. The fire burned the rope. They were no longer bound. No longer bound. And they were protected. So, once again, what was meant to harm them only allowed them to be freed. And not only did it allow them to be freed, but allowed a person who did not know them. So even though he was not in close relationship to God, he had to acknowledge that God was God. Because he says, there is no other God who's able to deliver like this. And keep in mind, as king, right, with powers and stuff, and King Nebuchadnezzar most likely saw a number of people be thrown into that furnace. Because it says 7 times more than the normal amount. They were doing this before. That's the reality. They were throwing people into the fire that did not obey the king. So he's had experience with this. But for him to say, there is no God that has delivered like this, that means that out of everyone else that has ever been put into that furnace who believed in what King Nebuchadnezzar believed in, no one was saved. Not like this. Which is why he's taken aback and he's like, listen, like, I was wrong. If anyone disrespects your God, because now I know there are not gods, there is one God. And if anyone disrespects your God, then they're going to have an issue with me. And that's why throughout this season, where we're being thrown into the fire, we have to keep in mind that yes, it might sting. Or it might not even sting, because sting is the word associated with hurt, but we might feel the heat. We're in the fire. We might feel the heat. It might be burning. It might be really hot in there. But we have to remember that we are not being touched. There's no harm that's being brought to us. This is solely so that whatever burdens that we have on us, we are going to be released from. And when people who have acted a certain way towards us look at us, especially those who caused us to be bound by some of these things, they're going to look at us and say, how? Because God. What you mean, because God? Because God. Because God got in it with me. The pain you caused me, God got into with me to guide me. And when you really think about it like this, when they were in the fire, right? And it says that they were walking around in the fire unharmed, right? And he's calling them, right? God is over there, I'm assuming. When you're in the fire, it's a lot of smoke, it's a lot of heat, a lot of like not really visibility. And it says God's also leading them to the door. In my mind, they got you over. In my mind, I would like to think that God was holding one of their hands and leading them, that they were all chain linked and walking through the fire. And God just led them to where they were supposed to go. And then when they called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were finally able to get out because God led them to the door where they were supposed to exit from. We can debate on it, but that's really the point that I wanted to make tonight for this video. I know it's a little bit different, not really as free flowing as some of the other episodes. I say some, but it's only been 2 episodes. Nonetheless, still giving the word, and I thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, share. I don't know who this is for, but God wanted me to share this with you and let you know that you're not alone. Made it very clear to me that through this season, a lot of us are going through the same thing, the same exact thing. So, if this video finds you, I hope it spoke to you. God is with you. You're in the fire, but it's not going to burn you, because this is just another opportunity for those around you to be exposed to God. And He's going to use it for His good, and you're going to be 100,000% fine. Just gotta believe it. All right. Thank you guys, and have a good night. Have a blessed one.